Hello everybody, on Blue Sky I recently made this post talking about every single weapon shouldn't be above 210. This was mostly made a bit after the third kits to reference balancing going forward. However, I figured I'd go more in depth about this because I think what wasn't clear is that this is not exclusively about Splatoon 3. So I want to take a look at all the 220 plus weapons in Splatoon history to find out if they were a good idea or not. Now in Splatoon 1 it was by special, and the only special to be 220 was the Inkzooka. This is a list of every weapon with Zooka. Might look like a lot for Splatoon 1, but remember we didn't have as many. Out of these weapons, the only ones to remain relevant were with the 220 Zooka was Carbon, which largely dropped off because of 220 Zooka plus medium depletion. And that's it. None of these other weapons would be super relevant for Zooka. Pretty much all of these had a different kit that was more popular. You could argue Tenatech is maybe up there as well, but Wasabi was better by the end game's lifespan. And 220 Zooka, or 220 plus heavy depletion for some of these, was the main reason for almost all of them. Pretty much all of these became irrelevant specifically because of 220p Zooka. So it's clearly a problem in that game, but that's only one game. So why don't we take a little road trip back to Splatoon 2? Yeah, welcome back to Splatoon 2. I think we might as well wait for the news, since we gotta remember that this used to be unskippable. But I think one thing I want to point out about Splatoon 2, Splatoon 2 did have two 30p weapons, which they did get rid of. We had Tenatech and Ballpoint. I'll talk about them more when I go over my Splatoon 2 meta history on the main channel, but both of those were reverted because both of those also ended up being too much. I'm just simply making the argument that the points for special that's too much should actually be a little lower than that. So, with the news completed, let's take a look at all the remaining 220p weapons in Splatoon 2. Obviously, there were some that got reverted, and we're not going to talk about as much, unless if I can remember them off the top of my head. And in general, we're going to take a look through this whole list and try to find our 220p weapons. So, here's our first one, Custom Explosher. I don't think many people are going to argue this, but yeah, for a heavy baller, 220 was a little too much. Dually Squelcher's rain output was definitely too low at 220. You pretty much exclusively saw the vanilla kit near the end of the game's life because of the 190p missiles being a lot better. 220 on Ray Charger was too much. Charger's painting had been fixed for a bit, and its output was way too horrible to compete with something like C-Jet, so that's out of the running. What else do we have here? I don't think anything on this page, right? Fun fact, N-Parry used to be 220, I'm pretty sure. I might have that wrong, but I'm almost certain it used to be 220 at some point, which also killed off the weapon's usage, because of course it did. I mean, it's 220. And yeah, I don't really know what order the weapons come up on screen. Wow, even Explo is almost 220. That's wild to think about. .220 on Ballpoint Nouveau. I wouldn't say it's a large factor in it not being used, but it certainly hurt it, especially given the special that it has isn't that powerful. Maybe use K-Doolies that was 220 instead. I'm not sure. 220 Firefin, like with Ray Charger, way too low of an output. Definitely hurt its relevancy, outside of some extremely niche situations, like Schellendorf Zones, for instance, where Suction Rush and Charger are both super good. Bucket Deco is 210 right now, but I know it used to be 220, and given that 210 was a big factor in its lack of use rate, 220 was definitely too much. This was a problem of Baller being overtuned. 220 L3 may be one of the few exceptions to this. Originally, I was going to only have one, but in Turf War, it was kind of broken. Though that being said, with Baller being nerfed, I don't think 210 is needed. This is more just a factor of Turf War's like bad balancing with Baller specifically. I think that might be it, actually. It is just Firefin Scope. Alright, so that's all of Splatoon 2. Let's jump to Splatoon 3 next. Alright, welcome to Splatoon 3. Now, generally, the devs have been a little bit more careful with balancing, so we don't have too many 220 weapons. In fact, there's only 3 of them to talk about so far, and I don't even know if we'll ever get any more. First one is Sloshing Machine. This was back during the anti-machine era, but, I mean, yeah, obviously today. Main weapons barely even seeing use in competitive play, if just not seeing any use at all. Fizzy's paint has been toned back. Machine's ink efficiency and fire rate, and therefore paint, have been toned back. 220 is absolutely absurd on this weapon. The other one is Squeezer. Again, maybe made some sense when it was nerfed. Initially, you could think it might be okay, but now, with Zooka being toned back, with less paint on the main weapon, 220 is way too low of an output for it to be fair. And then we get to the one weapon that I think might be the exception to this whole thing. And that is Pencil. Or Snipe Rider over here. As Pencil is very important to balance with a lower cooler output because it has a whole ton of gear freedom, and therefore can get cooler very fast while also being on a weapon that's very safe to get it. Because of that, it topples a lot of competition. And even then, I think you can make the argument otherwise. There are other ways you could fix the problem. Maybe force more gear dependency to reduce the charge-up amount you can run, just like a main saver nerf of some kind. You could reduce the painting range of, like, max distance shots to try and tone it back that way in exchange for 210. You could do something different, but I'd argue Snipe Rider's current balance spot is probably fine. I wouldn't mind if it was toned back a little bit in its backline matchup capacity, but maybe this one is okay. And even then, this exception is because of Cooler's important role as an almost necessary special, as well as this weapon's unique spot in terms of risk factor and pain output. It wouldn't apply to anything else. So, that's all the history examples. Sorry that took so long. But what am I trying to get at with this? My point is if a weapon ever has to go above 210, then the problem is probably not to do with the points for special. And you can look at any of the weapon examples throughout all 3 games that we've talked about, and if you really look at the balance problems of the weapons involved, you can find something different to balance about it. Right? Obviously, Splatoon 1 was mostly a factor if they did it for the whole special. Nothing needed to be there. You could probably have just made Zuka 210, and it would have been better. For Splatoon 2, you had stuff like, well, Explo used to spam a lot of its Baller, and Baller used to be stronger. Okay, but now Baller's weaker. We toned back Explo's paint. Points for special wasn't the thing that needed to be changed to fix that. It was Baller and Explo's paint that needed to be adjusted. If you look in this game, it's Fizzy's paint that was overtuned with Machine's old output of Booyah Bomb. It wasn't anything to do with Machine needing to be high points for special. Double Fizzy spam was simply too good. For Zuka on Squeezer, Zuka was just overtuned. Until 9.3, it wasn't toned back properly enough. That wasn't a problem with Squeezer specifically. That was a problem with Zuka. Furthermore, I think 220p tends to kill off weapons that really don't deserve it. I think it's an unnecessary weakness to have that low special output generally, and it's also really easy to stack with the weapon being over-nerfed. Because if your weapon is over-nerfed, you're more dependent on your weapon kit in order to make up for that, because obviously your main weapon will be weaker. But if you're also in 220p hell, you have a very hard time making up for that because it needs to fall into the main weapon. Machine is probably the best example of this, where both the main weapon and the kit have been so toned back to the point where the weapon doesn't see any use despite initially releasing with one of the strongest main weapons and kits in the game. Anyway, I'm not saying this is an inherently complicated topic or anything. I'm just saying that generally, I feel like if you have to go all the way to 220, there's probably something else that's actually the problem. That's it.